Laughter started before she even reached the line. It wasn't loud. That would have been too honest. It was the kind of laughter that moves through a group of men like a current. Quiet, knowing, passed from one to the next in sideways glances and half smiles that nobody had to explain. Carter heard it anyway. She always heard it. After 11 years in uniform, she had learned to read that particular silence the way some people read weather. She kept walking. The range at Fort Bragg on that Tuesday morning in late October was cold in the way that gets into your hands before your mind registers it. The kind of cold that makes your fingers slow. Carter noticed it. She filed it away without reacting, the way she had trained herself to do with most things that happened around her. There were 14 men already at the firing line when she arrived. 12 of them were from the 75th Ranger Regiment. The other 2 were observers. One from the battalion commander's staff, one she didn't recognize. They were all looking downrange or pretending to, which amounted to the same thing. The target was at 3,800 meters. That number matters. It matters the way specific numbers always matter in situations like this, not because they are dramatic, but because they are real. 3,800 meters is not a metaphor. It is not an approximation. It is 2 1/3 miles of air, wind, gravity, and the accumulated uncertainty of every variable that military snipers train their entire careers trying to understand and never fully do. The record for a confirmed kill at the time stood at just over 4 kilometers. That record was held by a Canadian. It had stood for years. Most people who understood what it meant did not expect to see it broken by anyone at a domestic training range on a cold Tuesday morning, certainly not by a logistics officer. Staff Sergeant Kane was the one who said it out loud. He said it to the man next to him, Monroe, but he said it at a volume that was not quite private. Carter caught maybe half the words. She caught enough. "What's she doing out here?" Monroe said something back that she didn't catch. Then Kane said, "Logistics," the same way you might say furniture, and that was the end of the conversation because it didn't require any further discussion. The point had been made. Everyone in earshot understood the point. Carter set her case down and began to unpack. She had been in the Army since she was 22. She had come in as an intelligence analyst, cross-trained into logistics at the request of a commanding officer who recognized an organizational mind when he saw one. And somewhere in between those two things, between the spreadsheets and the convoy manifests and the 12-hour shifts managing supply chains across 3 forward operating bases in eastern Afghanistan, she had also become one of the best precision shooters in her battalion, not by accident, not by talent alone, by the kind of repetition that most people quit before they reach. She didn't talk about it. That was her first rule. She had learned early that talking about what you could do before you did it was a tax on the doing. You paid twice. Once in the explaining, once in the performing, and the performance always suffered for having been announced. So she unpacked in silence. The rifle was a Chaytak M2 Interphase, chambered in .408. Chaytak. She had worked with this particular rifle for 3 years, had put somewhere north of 4,000 rounds through it, had documented every deviation, every environmental adjustment, every shift in performance across temperature ranges and altitude changes in barrel wear. The notebook in which she kept these records was not a notebook you could buy in a store. It was a composition book she had covered in olive drab tape with pages that were dense with a handwriting so small it looked, to people who saw it for the first time, like some kind of code. It wasn't code. It was just information. Carter had always believed that information, when recorded carefully enough and thought about seriously enough, eventually told you what to do. Ruiz was the range officer that morning. He was a good man, careful, by the book, someone who had been doing this long enough to have no opinion about anything except whether the paperwork was in order. He walked over to Carter while she was still setting up and stood at a slight distance the way people do when they are about to say something they'd rather not say. "Carter," he said. She looked up. "You understand this is a qualification exercise for the regiment's long-range element." "I understand. You've been cleared to observe. If Colonel Hale decides to allow you I understand," she said again. Not impatient, just clear. Ruiz nodded and went back to his clipboard. He didn't say anything else, which she appreciated. The regiment's 12 shooters went first, the way it had been arranged. This was not unusual. What was unusual was what happened over the next 3 hours, which was that none of them hit the target. This requires some explanation, because it would be easy to read that sentence and conclude that the regiment's shooters were inadequate. They were not. The men on that line were among the best trained precision riflemen in the United States Army. They had trained in environments that most people do not survive. They had made shots in conditions that would cause most civilian shooters to fold their equipment and go home, that were genuinely extraordinary by any objective measure. But 3,800 meters is a distance at which extraordinary is not always enough. The wind that morning was the problem, not the speed of it. That could be calculated, could be fed into a formula and compensated for with the appropriate holdover. The problem was its inconsistency. It shifted in direction by as much as 40 degrees across the distance between the firing line and the target, and it did so in patterns that resisted prediction. You could watch the wind indicators for 20 minutes and feel confident that you understood what you were seeing, and then the moment you broke the shot, the wind would do something else entirely, something that no data had suggested and no formula had anticipated, and the round would drift and the target would remain untouched. The 12th shot was the one that came closest. It was fired by a staff sergeant named Morrison, a man with 18 years in service and a reputation in the regiment that people spoke about the way people speak about weather, as a force of nature, not something that required evaluation. Morrison's round missed the target by 11 inches. He sat up from the rifle, looked downrange through his binos for a long moment, then set the binos down and said nothing. 11 inches at 3,800 meters is a remarkable miss. That is not sarcasm. In the physics of long-range shooting, 11 inches at that distance is a result of extraordinary skill applied to a problem that the environment refused to cooperate with. Morrison knew this. He was not embarrassed. He simply looked at the target and thought about what he would have done differently. Colonel Hale came to the line at this point. Hale was 61 years old and had the face of a man who had stopped being surprised by most things. Sometime around his mid-40s, he had 2 tours of Iraq, one of Afghanistan, a combat infantryman badge, and a disposition that people on his staff described as efficient when they were being diplomatic and impossible to read when they were not. He walked to the line and looked downrange and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Anyone else?" There was a silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds. Carter counted them. She raised her hand. Hale looked at her. This look lasted longer than his looks usually lasted, which was itself a form of communication. He was not looking at her with dismissal. He was looking at her with the particular attention of someone who was making a rapid calculation. "You're the logistics officer," he said. "Yes, sir." "Carter." "Yes, sir. You want to attempt this shot." It was not a question, but she answered it anyway. "Yes, sir." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Ruiz. Ruiz gave a minimal shrug that communicated, efficiently, that he had no objection. Hale looked back at Carter. "Set up," he said. This was the moment, not the shot. The moment before the shot, which in Carter's experience was always the harder thing. The shot itself was mechanical, was the product of information correctly processed and applied. The moment before was where every other variable lived. The weight of people watching, the specific texture of being doubted, the way silence can feel like pressure when it comes from enough people in the same direction. She felt none of it, or rather, she felt all of it and set it aside, not through an act of will, but through a habit of mind that had taken years to develop and that she could no longer entirely explain. It was simply what she did. She went somewhere quiet inside herself, where the only things that existed were the data she had gathered and the problem in front of her. She settled behind the rifle. The first thing she did was nothing. She watched the wind indicators downrange. There were 5 of them at intervals along the distance, and she watched them for 11 minutes without touching the rifle. Morrison, who was standing to her left, watched her do this and said nothing. He had been in this position himself. He understood the watching. What Carter was doing in those 11 minutes was not what it looked like from the outside. It was not patience exactly, or not only patience. She was building a model. In the years she had spent with this rifle, she had developed the ability to read the interaction between wind indicators in a way that allowed her to make probabilistic predictions about what the wind was likely to do in the next 15 seconds, not what it was doing, but what it was about to do, which was the relevant information when you were accounting for the time of flight of a round traveling 2 1/3 miles. The model was never perfect. She was clear about this in her own mind. It was an approximation of a complex system, and complex systems retain the capacity to surprise you. All she was doing was reducing the probability of being surprised to the lowest level the available data would support. She adjusted the scope turrets twice. Small adjustments. She checked the wind one more time. She breathed out. She squeezed the trigger. The round left the barrel at approximately 3,000 feet per second. What happened next took almost 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which the round was in the air, traveling downrange, subject to every variable she had attempted to account for and every variable she had not. 4 seconds is a long time to wait for information. She remained behind the rifle, eye to the scope, breathing normally. The impact hit slightly left of center on the target. She heard it before anyone said anything. The distant sound of the strike reached the line a fraction of a second after the visual confirmation through her scope, and in that fraction of a second she had already begun to process the deviation left of center, meaning she had slightly overcorrected for the wind shift she had anticipated in the middle segment of the flight path. Then she heard Monroe say, "She hit it." He said it quietly, not as an announcement but as a statement of fact, being processed out loud, the kind of thing people say when something happens that their minds haven't finished categorizing yet. Carter sat up from the rifle. Morrison was the first to walk over. He was carrying his binos. He had been watching through them when the impact occurred, which meant he had seen it more clearly than anyone else on the line. He stopped a few feet from Carter and looked at her in a way that was entirely different from how he had looked at her when she was setting up, and both of them knew it. Left of center, he said. 3 inches. The shift in the middle segment, she said. I miscalculated by about 3 degrees. He was quiet for a moment. 3 inches at 3,800 meters, he said. She didn't say anything. I want to know what you saw in the wind before you shot, he said. This was not a challenge. His voice had changed into the voice he used when he was asking technical questions that he actually wanted the answers to. She had heard this voice, this specific shift in register, from men like him before, and it was always, in her experience, the most honest version of them. They talked for 4 minutes about the wind, about the model she had built, about the point in the flight path where she believed the critical shift had occurred. He listened in the way that trained shooters listen to each other, completely, without the part of the mind that is formulating a response while the other person is still talking. At the end, he nodded once and said, I would have added 2 degrees right in the second segment, but I think you're right about where it shifted. Colonel Hale had not spoken since the shot. He walked over now, and the people around Carter and Morrison made way for him without being asked, the way people do when rank is not something that requires announcing. He stopped in front of Carter. He looked at her for the same duration he had looked at everything since she had known of him, which was efficiently and without any apparent need to fill the silence with something other than attention. Where did you learn to read wind like that? He said. Afghanistan, sir. FOB Salerno. I had a lot of time on the range while I was managing supply operations. He processed this. A lot of time. About 4,000 rounds over 3 years, sir. I kept records. I want to see the records. Yes, sir. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, We're running this exercise again in 3 weeks. Different distance. He paused. I'd like you to be here. Carter said, Yes, sir, because that was the correct response, and also because she meant it. Hale nodded and walked away. He did not say anything to the men standing around them. He didn't need to. What had just happened was information, and everyone on the line had received it. Kane was quiet on the drive back. Carter noticed this the way she noticed most things, without making it mean more than it meant. He was quiet. That was all. People process things at different speeds and in different ways, and what he was processing was his business. She had not made this day about him, and she was not going to make the aftermath about him either. Morrison caught up with her at the vehicle staging area. He was carrying his kit bag and had the look of someone who had been thinking through a problem. Carter, he said. She stopped. The notebook, he said. The records you mentioned. I've been keeping something similar for 6 years. I'd like to compare notes sometime. She looked at him. I'll bring it next time, she said. He nodded. He started to walk away, then stopped. That was the best cold bore reading of wind shift I've seen at that distance, he said. I want to be straight about that. She said, Thank you, Morrison. He nodded again and kept walking. She stood in the staging area for a moment after he was gone. The cold had gotten into her hands the way she had noticed it would at the start of the morning, and she put them in her pockets and looked at the sky, which had gone from gray to a lighter gray that suggested the cloud cover might break by afternoon. She thought about the 3-inch deviation. She thought about the 2 degrees Morrison had mentioned. She thought about what the data would look like when she put it into the notebook tonight. The specific moment in the wind sequence where she would annotate her miscalculation and what she would adjust the next time this flight path presented itself. She thought about Colonel Hale saying, "I'd like you to be here." Not as a gift, not as validation, simply as information she would file with the rest of it, alongside everything else she had learned that morning about wind and distance and the specific weight of being watched by people who expected you to fail. She had known, somewhere in the years of training and early mornings on ranges while other people were sleeping, that there would be a morning like this one. Not the applause. There hadn't been applause. Not the applause. There hadn't been applause. Not the acknowledgement. That had been quiet and practical and entirely without ceremony, just the morning itself. The problem. The data. The shot. That was the thing about this work, that she had never been able to explain to people who didn't do it. The validation was never the point. The point was the problem. The point was the 4 seconds the round spent in the air, and the question of whether you had done your homework well enough to know, before you broke the shot, what the answer was going to be. She had spent 11 years in this army being underestimated, and she had spent 11 years in this army building the answer to that problem, one round at a time, one notebook page at a time, one cold morning at a time. Today the wind had almost beaten her. It had come within 3 inches,